Kia ora koutou. Ko waio. Ko Joe Brand toku ingoa. Dr. Michael Stevens had to pop away. He had a prior engagement this afternoon, so I'm the super sub for you all. So lucky. And we've got some really exciting speakers coming up before we finish off today. But just so you feel assured, Michael will be back a popo. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our next session, being led by the vivacious Stephanie Voigt.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Steph Voigt toku ingoa, ko te manatū whakiato ora takamahi tēnei. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Steph Voigt, and I'm Regional Commissioner for Social Development for our Southern Region and Regional Public Service Commissioner for Murihiku. I've been asked to chair this session, which is around social regeneration. So, social regeneration is about social interventions and approaches embedded alongside environmental and economic dimensions of a holistic regeneration strategy for a community or place. Social regeneration can occur where there is an overarching vision for the community or place that coordinates all three aspects of regeneration: social, environmental and economic. So social regeneration is inherently a less tangible process, one that's harder to articulate than either environmental or economic regeneration. To build an equitable and regenerative future for all people in Murihiku, we need to seek to build bold new ways of collaborating across iwi, sectors, disciplines and communities with this in mind. As a member of the Enduring Oversight Group for our Just Transitions program, which we heard about earlier, I can honestly say that we are ahead of the game in having these conversations and structures across sector, supported by mana whenua and in place here in Murihiku. I think seizing the unique opportunity that's been laid out this morning will require bold leadership to ensure we integrate our collective principles, values and efforts, enabling us to navigate through uncertainty, unexpected events, to build and commit to a common vision for Murihiku, which turns into tangible actions. So in amongst an environment of economic and environmental opportunities, the window for true, equitable social regeneration is wide open. Social regeneration principles are founded in the connection to place and transformation, and in turn the potential for generating holistic programs and actions that result in building inclusive and equitable communities that are future fit. I'm pretty sure that's the future we all desire for Murihiku. Increased collaboration and coherence leading into improved equity of outcomes and increased wellbeing for this generation and for future generations. We can have a fantastic economy, achieve environmental aspirations and the most beautiful whenua in the world, but if the people living within the economy and environment are not well and not prospering within it sustainably, then you have to question, what have we truly achieved? So social regeneration is about life opportunities, well-being and equity, delivering great places that serve the people who live in them well. So I just want to touch a little bit on social sector commissioning, which some of you in the room may have heard of. So October last year, government announced our social sector commissioning action plan from 2022 through to 2028. So what's different in this approach? Traditionally, we've been about procurement. So procurement is about acquiring services, in other words, the process of putting a service out to tender. Commissioning involves using all the resources that are available to support people to have better and more independent lives through understanding, developing and deliver better services and support across an area. Social sector commissioning is part of how we will work to make the system work better to achieve wellbeing and equal outcomes across individual whānau and wider communities. We're using this as an opportunity with Murihiku Regeneration and the Just Transitions program here in Murihiku to apply and attest this approach. We want to be able to articulate and demonstrate the true social regeneration that we'll achieve here in Murihiku. So it's early days, but I have no doubt that at a future wānanga I can share more around how that's going. But we do have a couple of people from our cross-agency team that are doing this mahi around social sector commissioning here, Kerry and Kayla, just over there. So please do seek them out if you want to engage more on this and how that can help transform the whole of our community. So, with that, it's my job as session chair to introduce our first of our speakers for this session, which is going to be Professors Darren Hodgetts and James Liu from Massey University, talking around social regeneration plan. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm Darren, grew up in Macquarie Street in South Invercargill, and it's really nice to be back here visiting whānau who still live in that area, and I do try and come back as much as possible. Oh, it does work. Also speaking on behalf of a bit of a group that works increasingly in the back house of Mirihiku Regen, to acknowledge Tai Tipani and Mātua Mike for your leadership, and Michael in particular for those conversations we've been having, and Terry, of course, and Mike Shatford for organising everything and kind of getting us here today. What we've been doing, the last session was interesting, we were talking about social licence, but can we develop a framework or a set of principles for social licence, and what concepts would that kind of framework be based on, and how might we action it? So we're kind of in the infant stages of developing a framework, and what we wanted to do today is really talk about some of the concepts and ideas we've been speaking to. So I'll do a bit of talking for the next 15 minutes, as well as my colleague James Liu, and that's quite important because we've been looking cross-culturally, cross-societally, and looking at, in particular, about how do traditional societies manage what we might call the commons, or the shared resources that we rely on as human beings for our sustainability, our growth, our well-being, and so on. Of course, also what we're doing is we're doing this in relation to the 4 po that have been identified as part of Mirihiku, and also in relation to things such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Because if we can get a framework right in this space, we can improve our responses to those things and hopefully regenerate a planet that's sustainable for us all long term. So what we're going to do today is just talk through a few concepts, and what I'll do is I'll hand over to James kind of halfway through to talk about relational ethics in particular. So we've put the axolotl up there deliberately. This is a very regenerative species, and the reason I like this image in particular is if the axolotl is wounded, loses an arm, it can regrow that arm. If we start thinking about human beings not as isolated, lonely thinkers that process information and wander around autonomously in the world, but as enmeshed and integrated beings that rely on their environment, the environment seeps into them, what we do collectively in our activity has that reciprocal effect, then we start thinking about things quite differently. Also, we're not the first group to start thinking about social regeneration as a concept and to try and develop these kind of frameworks. So the other thing we're doing is looking at different options and different frameworks in different places. And I won't read this one out, but it's actually from Southwark, from a council. And I think some of the issues that have been spoken to today about inclusion and including everyone are really important. Yesterday's session was fascinating, you know, being there and working with the school teachers who are doing the science teachers who are going to be teaching the hydrogen stuff in our schools was quite fascinating because there was a lot of emphasis there on the notion of inclusion. The idea that as we educate our young people and we develop those technical jobs, that we can staff those ourselves, and that, of course, contributes to the regeneration of the region and so on, because we need decent work. Decent work is one of those multiplier things that has all sorts of ramifications. Some conceptual ingredients we've been working with, I've just mentioned, we've got to recognise the interconnectedness of human beings. We create our socioeconomic environments. They're not there by accident. And also we've got to think multi-generationally. Now there are several whakatauki, of course, that Mirihiku and other groups are using, but there are also ideas and similar thinking around the world that we might look from or look to. So the idea that these commons that we'll talk about aren't just ours, they're generations in 20 generations' time, those young people and so on are incredibly important as well, and we need to start thinking and planning in that way. Now we know Māori think and plan in that long-term way, but we as a society really need to get on board with that kind of thinking and approach. And also the idea that any growth and any development here has to be about regenerating and sustaining the collective future of the people that live in this union, that live in this region. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit initially about the commons, so the air, the land, the sea, the institutions, but also the opportunities. Now, when we were thinking about this concept, I'm sure people may be familiar with the Magna Carta, which underlies a lot of principles within the legal system we have here that we inherited from the British and so on. What people don't really know about is a document called the Charter of the Forest. Now, the Charter of the Forest in that feudal society was about what are the resources that peasants needed in order to sustain themselves, to thatch roofs, build homes, heat homes, the charcoal industry, and so on, which were incredibly important. This document is actually a document about rights and freedoms. We might talk about customary gathering, we might talk about access to resources and so on. But when we look at these rather ancient texts, there are insights within there about it in times of change and social instability, the commons becomes a really, really important concept to think through and to think about. And these are really the resources we need to protect collectively to sustain life, but also to regenerate ourselves as a community and as a region. Now, the commons aren't just natural resources like rivers and so on. They're also things that we can create, that we can inherit, and that we can pass on. But we need to think about how do we govern these, how do we care for these, and how do we ensure that people benefit collectively from them so that they can flourish. Now, locally we might say the iwi councils, community business and so on all have a stake in being guardians of the commons. So where do we have the conversations about that? What are the frameworks we might use to guide that collective decision making as we move forward? I'd also give a nod to the next speaker that in a sense MSD, or the Ministry of Social Development, is an articulation of the commons. We collect tax, we generate a resource, and we pay for things like national superannuation through that. So these are quite important concepts I think that we need to be thinking about collectively. There are also concepts that for Māori in the room won't be new, won't be surprising. There's a whole language and a whole set of principles around these kind of ideas that I think we need to take quite seriously as a nation as we move forward and consider these things. We might think about Eleanor Ostim's work, Nobel Prize in Economics in '89, looking at traditional societies and how they govern the commons. There's something natural about human beings in that we've evolved to develop social norms that are really about cooperation. A lot of talk about things like Charles Darwin saying survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin never said survival of the fittest. What Darwin said is species that cooperate thrive. And if we don't start cooperating a lot better and a lot more clearly through frameworks, we're going to struggle to survive as a species. And it's really heartening to see some of the science that's been going on over the last couple of days and has been presented, because I get a sense in which, in particular, the physical scientists are very, very aware of this need and how we might move forward together. So really this approach we've been developing is about recognising that people and the environment are fundamentally interdependent, and the economies we create need to take that centrality quite centrally if we are to avoid things like what's called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons occurs when someone gets a bit selfish, takes too much, or exploits a resource so that it's no longer available to everybody else to use and to draw on and to survive through. And really when that happens, when the tragedy of commons happens, what it is a transgression of those rights and freedoms that are acknowledged in documents such as the Charter of the Forest. And it's something that we need to make some decisions about. It also aligns very closely with the Sustainable Development Goals, which New Zealand has signed up to, which is a global framework of 17 interconnected goals that are about how do we ensure that the planet is sustainable for us moving forward into the future. And underlying those SDGs has to be a set of ethics and a set of principles that guide us in the direction of ensuring our collective well-being. So some questions we've been thinking about, and I'd like you to think about as well today, are what are our commons? What social norms are likely to promote the regeneration of the commons rather than the tragedy of the commons? And what are the implications of the commons for extractive industries, or what traditionally have been extractive industries? I'll just hand over to James.
Thanks, Darren. Tina koutou katoa. 各位先生、女士，你好。 It's a pleasure to speak to you about a cultural perspective of some of the things that Darren has talked about before, because there's a danger of positioning this as something that's unusual or only within a Maori dominant space, and it's not. I want to talk about relational ethics because they enable unity within diversity to thrive. And this is a very, very ancient system. Being ethnically Chinese myself, I'm going to connect some of the things within this space to things that are happening in the majority world around the world. So relational ethics enable groups to deal with different others in different ways that maintain their own enduring values and practices. And this is quite important because the liberal democratic approach has been so dominant for so long, but we have to realize that its history is actually quite a bit shorter than some of these other ways of working. And as the world grows closer together, we need to understand each other better and understand these worlds don't have to collide. They can work together in harmony with one another. So, relational ethics asks individuals to consider how they might apply different principles to different relationships that they have with different types of interactional partners. So the obvious one is in the business world. In the business world, you have an instrumental relationship between two entities, and they calculate rewards and costs. You've heard a lot of this in the previous sessions. However, if you go to Japan, for instance, the business partners have generally been working together for decades, if not generations. And that's an enduring system. So they can move even an instrumental exchange system into something that has relational ethics. And Westerners found breaking into the Japanese market quite difficult. I'm not saying that's better or worse. I'm just saying this is quite anchored in many parts of the world, and we have that here. That's an asset for us in the Southland to be able to work with people in other parts of the world. Relationships can also be enduring partnerships where other factors govern reciprocity. For Ngaitahu, chief among these would be whakapapa. This is one thing that as an ethnic Chinese I understand very well, because a principal value for Chinese is a thing called xiao dao, which is filial piety. So that's an aspect of respecting your whakapapa. So these are the kinds of values that are enduring. And if you understand these collectivities behave according to these enduring values, even if you're working within a liberal democratic space, you can function better because you can be assured that your relational partner is going to operate to these reliable and time-enduring principles. Yes? Am I? Oh, I've gone too far. Okay. And so relationships building should be a goal of regenerative planning. And of course, this regeneration is healing in so many ways. It's healing of colonization as a decolonizing process, and it also invites people like myself with this face into a formally bicultural space where our values can interact and be acknowledged. Each organization, I hope, as we talk about this process over the next couple days and into the future, should be able to identify organization members in another organization who are committed to building bridges required for long-term regional regeneration. Some of these organizations, for instance, Ngaitahu, may have more long-term goals and visions that can have others, for instance, democratically elected councils, who have more short-term goals. You know, we need to acknowledge that we can all work together, but we operate according to different principles. And the goal is to be able to advance relationships building so that more relationships become either closer and enduring, or at least understand the principles behind that other organization, why they're making the choices they are. So the graph that I'm showing on the right is by a professor from Taiwan named K.K. Huang, and he's saying that it's not simply either or. So on the one hand, you have instrumental ties. This is the typical business relationship, and you follow an equity rule. You know, what goes in, what comes out. You've got to be able to operate a business according to business principles of exchange if you want to survive. However, those aren't the only relationships. On the bottom, we have expressive ties. Expressive ties are those that exist among whānau members, among family. And there, it's not an instrumental exchange, it's a need rule. It's love, it's araha, so many things that go into this. But Those are not a dichotomy. They don't form polar opposites. In every relationship, in every transaction, people are trying to come closer to one another. It might not be simply making a contract, but it might be more than that. It might be making an enduring social contract. So I hope you can take these into account because it's a more holistic view of connecting things. And Darren's going to take you through, in the global context, how you might do this with our third missing member, who was supposed to cover the Sustainable Development Goals, but Darren is a very handy guy, so he'll be able to do both of these. Back to you.
Thanks, James. I hope I live up to that expectation. It's a pity Stuart Carr can't be here, because one thing that our group's done is we have interacted with UNESCO and the UN, so we now host what's called a United Nations chair. Stuart's chair is in sustainable livelihoods and decent work. And that's one of the reasons why in this slide we've used an ILO graphic to show you the 17 social development goals or sustainable development goals, as well as decent work being central, because decent work is a multiplier. If you've got decent jobs, affordable housing, affordable power, and as was said yesterday, you know, power poverty is real. A lot of old people can't heat their homes and so on, or young people and so on. You can't afford electricity and the like. That has a multiplier effect. And we know that we end up picking up those costs in the health system, for example. Now, these sustainable development goals are all interrelated with one another. Global consultation has gone into these things. New Zealand has signed up to them. I think we do an annual report on our progress towards things like poverty reduction, inclusion. You'll notice that 17 is partnership. This is another driving goal. And one of the things we're really interested in and trying to contribute is what are the principles on which Mirihiku regeneration can be based. And that really is about partnerships, and partnerships have to be one of those goals. I'd also acknowledge that there's some really interesting work going on. We did a statistical analysis for ETU, the trade union, who have developed a really robust scale from doing qualitative work with their members to what is a decent job, what's a livelihood you need, and so on. Extrapolating out a set of ideas from that and then developing a scale to reliably measure it across population groups. It's a very, very robust instrument, and I know that there's a survey happening at the moment in Mirihiku with workers trying to establish the extent of decent work and so on in this particular region. And one of the reasons we've been talking about the commons and the SDGs is the SDGs really are a framework for trying to not only sustain the commons, because we know a lot of the commons have been degraded over more than a century now. So it's not just about sustaining what we have, and a lot of the climate change and mitigation action is about regenerating. So those two things are not mutually exclusive, they're important, but we kind of need to regenerate things before we think about sustaining them at that better level. Central, of course, is things like inclusion and so on. And decent work is a form of economic inclusion that has a multiplier effect. Now, we're both psychologists. We dabble in the world of work around that research. And one thing that's quite clear in our literature is that decent work has a huge multiplier effect for community sustainability, for inclusion, reduced morbidity and mortality rates. These things are quite closely correlated with each other. So, Mirihiku regeneration attempts to walk the talk, as we see it, of these 17 sustainable development goals. There are global frameworks that we can connect to and we can contribute to. In some ways, Mirihiku, from what we've been reading, is ahead of the game. It really is getting everybody from these diverse backgrounds in a room to start that conversation, to start moving forward together in an inclusive kind of manner. And it seeks to provide a framework for investment that will facilitate social regeneration and collective clustering as a result. It balances. So when industry comes to places and it looks at setting up, it does its due diligence, and part of that is a social impact assessment. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at these social impact assessments. There are really good aspects to these things, and I think there's really good intentions behind them. We've looked at some of Woodside's one, we've looked at others as well, but they are from the investor's perspective. So really what we're talking about here is what is Mirihiku's perspective. And how can we marry these two things up so we can reach, as James is always harming on about, a society has to have harmony. And we have to harmonise these competing interests in a way of a win-win. It doesn't have to be either or, win-loss, and so on. So that's one of the things we've been thinking about. As more than risk mitigation strategies, this is about community social regeneration, regional social regeneration. So with that, one of the things we wanted to do is we resisted the temptation to start setting out some draft principles and so on, but rather to ask some questions, like what does the near future look like for us with energy and climate transitions? What threats and opportunities do we see as a group? How might we ensure the economic investment protects the commons and promotes community flourishing? How do we harmonise sustainable communities with the regeneration of our environment, both built and natural? And I can see in the CBD there's been a lot of work done in the last couple of years around the earthquake strengthening and so on. What principles should guide us in governing the commons collectively? And of course, councils and institutions like that have a clear democratic role in those processes, as does central government and the iwi. Can such principles be used to guide developments so people want to live here and contribute to the regeneration of the region? These are the kind of questions we're asking ourselves and trying to develop answers to. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Ngā mihi, James and Darren, for that. That was really insightful and got me thinking, certainly. So now I'm going to invite my colleague Gareth Williams, who is our General Manager System Performance within our Strategy and Insights team at the Ministry of Social Development, to share some data on the picture here in Murihiku.
All right, well, ngā mihi nui, o te wā kia tātou katoa. Kia ora, my name is Gareth Williams, and as Steph mentioned, I'm the General Manager of System Performance at MSD, and I think what we've seen today is a real variety of presentations, and so what we'll do is we'll just sort of build on some of that variety with what we're seeing through a bit of an accelerated journey of some of the key statistics and insights that we capture at MSD that we use for our monitoring and for our decision making. And I think some of what I'll share today will be reasonably intuitive, particularly for those of you who are on the ground in Murihiku. Some of it might be a surprise, and there might be actually the odd number or two which is reasonably confronting. But hopefully what that does is that gives us a good strong foundation to have some good conversations, and particularly sort of connecting some of those dots between those conversations around employment and getting skilled employment and the opportunities that can come from that. So just before we look forward and before we look at the present, just wanted to do a bit of a reflection actually on where we've come from and really acknowledge the challenges that we've faced both in Murihiku and nationally as a result of the pandemic. And so if we go back to March 2020, which is when the pandemic started, we experienced a pretty large increase in the number of people coming onto a benefit. And you can see from that graph that it happened in a pretty short space of time. And in the Murihiku region, we saw about 1,400 people come onto a benefit. And that reflects about a 30% jump in benefit numbers, which is pretty consistent with what we've seen nationally as well. And so with that increase in benefit numbers, we knew that we had to get New Zealanders back to work, and we knew we had to get New Zealanders back to work quickly. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that the longer you spend on a benefit, the harder it is to get off a benefit. And the result that we saw from that, and again we've seen this nationally, but we've also seen that within Murihiku, is we had record exits into work during those couple of years throughout the pandemic. And that was really a result of a response from wider government, from MSD, but also local council, iwi, communities and industry all pulling together to try and get people back into work. And of course, alongside that, there are still challenges that remain. So this is a current snapshot of where we are at in the Murihiku region. There's still 6,000 people on on a main benefit. And if you look at how that starts to sort of disseminate, we've got 1,500 who are work ready. We've got 3,000 or sort of 50% that are in a health condition or disability or a supported living benefit, and 1,300 who are on a sole parent. And if we just sort of dig a little bit deeper into our rangataki, our youth, what we can see from there, and this comes from actually a recent report that we've just published, is that they are going to need more support from us. So, for example, there you've got they're 2.4 times more likely to come from intergenerational benefit history. They're 2.2 times more likely to have not achieved NCEA level 2. And if you look at sort of what that means, and I think if there's sort of one number that you want to take away from this presentation today, this is it, that we estimate that they will spend a future 19 years on benefit. And I think that in itself is a pretty confronting number, right? And when you think about what that means, not just for the 1,000 young people that are in the Murihiku region, but also their whānau, their community, their children, this is where we really want to be thinking about how can we reduce that future lifetime or that future estimate on benefit. And I just wanted to sort of just cover off with just a couple of other slides. So one of the other areas that we monitor quite regularly is what happens to people when they leave the benefit system. And what this graph here shows is it tracks this percentage of people who have left the benefit, either for exits into employment, exits into tertiary study, or into apprenticeships or industry training, and what is the percentage that have stayed off benefit for 12 months after they left that benefit. And we can see from that dark blue line compared to those lighter blue lines that what we've seen in the most recent round of reporting is there's been quite a big jump actually in the number of people who have been able to, or the percentage of people that have been able to stay off benefit. And that's positive, particularly when you're overlaying it with the work exits, the record work exits that we talked about as well. But of course, there's reasons behind some of these figures and kind of what we've seen. And one of them in particular is that we've been operating in a pretty favourable labour market conditions. And we know that the economic climate is changing. And so again, another sort of challenge or something for us to think about is how do we sort of sustain or even improve on those sustainability rates that we've talked about. And the other one I'd probably just draw in there is that green line just sort of to the right of that reflects what we're seeing from a national perspective. And you can see on particularly the exits into work that nationally that sustainability rate's been a bit higher than what we've seen in Murihiku. And I think the reason for that ties into sort of the seasonality and some of those trends that we have in the region. And so the industry that has the highest proportion of work exits is manufacturing. And as many of us will know, the sort of what makes up that manufacturing is primarily meat processing. And so how that flows on is that we see that there are those lower sustainability of employment, 23%, and that's actually about half what we would sort of see nationally. And so sort of, I suppose, just to wrap this up and to bring this together, the other challenge or the other area for us to think about is that these are inherently seasonal industries, and that can be difficult to change. But how are we looking at it from a system point of view? How are we looking at it across industry so that we can keep people in the Murihiku region in employment and using sort of creative and sort of innovative solutions to do that? So look, that was what I wanted to cover today. There's a lot of information that sits in behind these statistics. If you want to connect further and sort of look at what we've discussed today, or sort of dig a bit deeper, there are my contact details. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Ngā mihi nui.
Okay, so I think, the 19.1 years, obviously being from within MSD, that's not figures or stats that are unfamiliar to me, but it still gets you every time, And you think, so knowing that, what will you or the collective we do about that here in Murihiku. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow. We can share more detailed kind of thoughts on what we are doing and some of the partnerships we've got in place down here to start hitting some of these intergenerational issues we're seeing down here. I just want to do a bit more of a plug around the Decent Work survey that Darren mentioned. So that is live in Murihiku at the moment. Just Google Decent Work Murihiku, you'll find the link. We want as many people working, not working, volunteering, everyone in the community to complete that survey so we can get a really rich picture of what is important down here. Okay, so it's literally me between afternoon tea, so I'll wrap it up as quick as I can. But I introduced myself at the start as the Regional Public Service Commissioner for Murihiku. So I just want to touch a little bit on the Regional Public Service kaupapa. And it is really about strengthening regional system leadership by working to understand, coordinate and align central government decision makers with local needs and aspirations. So a huge privilege. But I think as a base condition for us to do this, we really need to ensure we do have that strong relational capital, stuff, Darren, that we're talking about, live here in Murihiku, building that team Murihiku. And I think the power of events like this, having us all in the room, growing, understanding and connecting alone is massive. I've already seen a massive amount of side hustle and mahi taking place in the first half of the day, and I'm looking forward to that continuing and growing my own relational capital for the rest of the day and into tomorrow. So ka mihi nui, kia koutou katoa. Afternoon tea. Yep.